Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about bookish things going on in the world. And this, of course, has been a very big week for book things going on in the world. We had the winner of the National Book Award, which I did a whole reaction to. It will be down below. Got the winner of the Giller Prize, which I didn't do a reaction to, but we'll talk about in a moment. The Washington Post released its 10 best books of the year. I will have a link to the video I filmed this morning in the description box down below. So you're seeing a lot of this flannel and this Edward Gorey t-shirt that I'm wearing today. If you would prefer to skip over the chatty portion of the video, the stuff I'm going to talk about before we get to the Friday reads, you may do so. There will be a timestamp in the description box down below. There are a couple of things. We're going to talk about an author who had an article come out about him that adds a lot of problematic texture to who he was. We'll talk about that. And we will talk about a problem I'm having with Scribd and Everand a little bit. There will be some fun things to talk about. We'll be talking about being kind to people during the holidays, and then we'll get into the reading week as such. Teddy is walking around. You can probably hear him. He is feeling too antsy to sit for a proper Friday Reads video. I did try, and he was like, no, I'm not into this right now. So he's kind of wandering around. It is very cold, and more importantly, it's very rainy where we live right now. So he didn't really get a walk this morning. The rain has stopped, so hopefully when I finish my workday, I will be able to take him for a walk and get him a little bit of excitement. He's just not feeling it right now. But you'll probably hear him as he walks around. The first thing that I wanted to mention was an extremely kind gift that I got this week from Jen the Librarian. I will have a link to her channel down below. And if you follow along, you've heard me mention her channel a lot. It's one of my favorite BookTube channels. And if you follow along, you know that Maurice by E.M. Forster is one of my favorite books. And it's one of my favorite books because it is a case of the right book finding you at the right time. I was in my early or even mid-20s at that point and really coming to terms with the fact that I had been trying to remain in the closet, and I was starting to realize this isn't really working. It's not what I want, and was toying with the idea of coming out. So I started reading a lot of books, almost like doing research. It's the kind of thing I do. Sometimes I will want to seek out books that will help orient me in the world, but of what and in that case, that meant reading classic gay literature. If you've read classic gay literature, it's depressing because in order to be published, the gay character usually had to be punished because at the time, being gay was seen as a criminal offense. So a lot of gay literature was just totally depressing and not helpful to me at all. And somebody came over to my father's house at a dinner party, and somehow the topic of gay literature come up, and I had mentioned that I had just read The City and the Pillar by Gore Vidal. Very, very heavy book and sad. And I kind of mentioned, it's they're all just so sad. He recommended Maurice, and I read it, and it changed my life and really helped me, make me feel better. And I reread the book as part of an E.M. Forster read-along, which was, 2 years ago at this point? At what is time? I don't even know. And there were aspects of the book that didn't hit me the same way after all of this time, but it will always be a book that is really important to me. And the weird thing is, it's difficult to find attractive versions of E.M. Forster books. I have a boxed set that Joel gave me for my birthday a year or 2 years ago, and those are gorgeous. But it's hard to find nice individual copies of the books. So I think Jen and I had exchanged a message or a comment or something about how there was finally this nice edition, a hardcover edition of Maurice coming out. And I wasn't going to buy it for myself. And she sent it to me, which was so kind. And look at how gorgeous that is. It has an introduction by Colm Tabine. And it has a quote from the book on the back that says, "His heart leapt alive and shook him to pieces. It cried, 'You love and are loved.'" And the blurb from Colm Tabine on the back is, "A monument to a moment when change seemed possible." And I really want to also show you what this book looks like without the dust jacket, because it begins at university. Is it Oxford or Cambridge? Cambridge, where Maurice meets someone he thinks he loves. So without the dust jacket, look at how gorgeous this is. It's absolutely stunning. I'm so happy to have this book. I'm happy that I have the box set of the really attractive editions of E.M. Forster books, but they kind of live in the box set over, you can't really see it, but it's over on that bookshelf behind me. This is going to live faced out on my bookshelf right up here. So say goodbye to Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe by Fanny Flagg, which is going to be turned spined out, and next time I film a video, you will be seeing Maurice by E.M. Forster, like right about there, somewhere around there, faced out on the shelf. And again, thank you to Jen, the librarian, for sending this to me, because when it came, it's so pretty that I just stared at it for a really long time. So that's fun. And then let's talk a bit about the Giller Prize really quickly. So Held by Ann Michaels was the winner of the prize. I haven't read it. I've decided at this point that I am not likely to read it because the feedback I get on it is so wildly mixed. There are people who like it a lot. There are people who appreciate it but don't really enjoy it. And there are a lot of people who dislike it pretty heavily. So I feel like I'm just going to stay out of it. Maybe I'll revisit, well, not maybe. At some point, I do want to revisit Fugitive Pieces. And I say revisit, but I've never read it for the first time. So that is the one of hers that I would read, and I'll sort of leave Held out on its own. And one of the reasons I haven't really been covering the Giller Prize this year is that there's been very inconsistent mention of whether or not people want me to cover it, but there's also a lot of controversy about their sponsor, and there was actually picketing and protesting outside of the wherever the announcement was made. I'll have a link to an article about it from Publishers Weekly down below if you want more information about it. But that is a thing that happened. Then the National Book Award happened, and that went to James by Percival Everett. And again, I have a reaction video to that one, which you can find in the description box down below. Let's talk about the complicated author thing. And Vanity Fair, sorry, yes, it is Vanity Fair. I thought it was a different magazine for a second, but it is Vanity Fair. Released an article this week about Cormac McCarthy, where the person who did the interview talked to Augusta Britt, who had a relationship with Cormac McCarthy for 47 years. They met when Cormac McCarthy was 42 and Augusta Britt was 16. And she was a muse to Cormac McCarthy. Some of the elements of the way she lived her life, the way she spoke, and things that had happened to her made their way into his novels. And in very interesting ways, the article that I will link down below goes into this all at pretty great length. And of course, the real big takeaway from this is not just that they uncovered a muse for Cormac McCarthy, who has passed away recently, but that she was underage when they met. And I am not trying to have a conversation where I'm saying like, hey, we're canceling Cormac McCarthy. That's not what I'm doing. I've talked about this a fair amount on and off. You know, people are complicated. And I think we need to reckon with those things. And often when you start having a conversation like this, I can feel like some people like immediately at their keyboards already clacking away to say, you have to separate the art from the artist. However, he wrote Augusta Britt into his novels, often as a man, because there are not a whole lot of female characters in his books. So he often took versions of her and put them into a male persona in his books. And which is kind of interesting on its own. Like you could write a whole thesis paper about that on its own. But he wrote her into his books. So when you say you separate the art from the artist, you really can't. I've been saying that for years. You really can't always do that. And Woody Allen is another big one for that. People say you separate the art from the artist, but Woody Allen wrote himself into his movies as a character many, 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 many times. And a lot of those characters had attractions to and sought sexual relationships with women who were underage or married or like all kinds of things. So you can't really separate the art from the artist. it's an interesting conversation to have. And, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. It is interesting that, when the controversy about Alice Munro came up about a year ago, it feels like I immediately saw that reported on in multiple different locations. I've had multiple people tell me over the last year, I will not read or reread Alice Munro's work anymore because she has become distasteful to me. And I understand that. I'm not trying to shame anyone who said that. I think this is something you need to decide for yourself, but it is good to have this information because it can color how you read their work and how you understand their work. So when you go back and you read, say, Blood Meridian, which had not been published and is now recognized as one of Cormac McCarthy's best books, perhaps his best book, even though he won a Pulitzer Prize for, it's hard to hold up because it's a shiny cover, but also my hand was covering the title, The Road. This seemed to be his most known book, but after The Road was published and won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, it felt like people sort of reappraised his early work, and earlier works such as Blood Meridian became what he is more known for now. Like, people haven't forgotten The Road. I don't think they will forget The Road, but it feels like a lot of attention goes in this direction much more easily at this point. So when you read, say, Blood Meridian or All the Pretty Horses, which is kind of about, involves a lot of the stories that she told. And again, look at the article for more information. It adds texture and understanding. And it's a very uncomfortable article to read because, again, he was 42, she was 16 at the time that they met. And she was in a foster home, and it was an abusive foster home. And she told him at one point that he asked why she wasn't home. And she told him, honestly, that she liked to go to this pool in the town because she could shower there without men trying to come into the room. So she was someone who had been abused and sexually abused and taken advantage of by men, and men who were supposed to be taking care of her. And they kept in touch. So the next year, Cormac McCarthy decided to get her out of that situation and took her to Mexico. So at that point, he's 43 and she's 17. Still a wild age gap. And I kept grimacing more and more and more. Like, the cringe kept getting harder as I was reading through the article because I was waiting to find out if it was a sexual relationship at that point. So I started skimming ahead a little bit, and it was a sexual relationship. And for context, I am 42 years old right now. I cannot fathom having a sexual or intimate relationship with a 16-year-old. And so there's your context. I am exactly the age that Cormac McCarthy was when he met Augusta Britt. And that is especially troubling because, as I said, she had a history of being abused and taken advantage of by men, and men who were supposed to be in a caretaker role for her. So for him to sort of assume, say, I will protect you, come to Mexico with me, and then they begin a sexual relationship, that is really not great. And you can comment. I can feel people, again, getting ready to type and saying it was a different time. I feel like by the time Cormac McCarthy met Augusta Britt, mores about older men and younger women were already changing. Lolita had already been on the market. So it doesn't really make it better. And the fact that they had a decades-long relationship, at some points they lived together, sometimes they didn't. It's interesting. And again, I'm not saying we can't read Cormac McCarthy, but I do find it interesting. And I said this before, but I didn't actually finish the thought. That's the way my brain kind of works, especially lately. Alice Munro, it was reported on multiple times that people weren't going to read her books or were not going to reread her books anymore. And it was reported in multiple outlets when that came out. And we're not going to get into that controversy. You can Google it if you want to get more information about that. This information about Cormac McCarthy has been out for a couple of days now, and I've only seen it in one place. And so it feels like there are so many reasons that could be. It is interesting that the older white male author seems to be getting a lot more leeway. but we'll see what the ultimate, if the story kind of picks up and gains any kind of traction. I do think it's interesting because clearly this is something that shaped his work. And I think it should be there in any conversation about Cormac McCarthy. And it's not that you shouldn't read Cormac McCarthy, but Augusta Britt helped shape many of these books and formed them, and clearly formed Cormac McCarthy and the rest of his career after they met. So it's an interesting conversation to have. And I'll kind of leave it there. I'll link the article down below. This is not the forum to really get into a big intellectual discussion of Cormac McCarthy and his works. I do feel like maybe when I get around to rereading The Road for my Pulitzer Prize project, maybe we can get into it then. But now is not the time. And, I don't pretend to be an authority on this subject, but I do think it colors the way you look at his work. And for that reason, it's worth talking about. And it was news. So it's an interesting, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts of it in the comment section down below. I had trouble with Scribd, which is now known as Everand, and I never remembered the new name. I only remember it now because I've had so many problems with it. Now, if you remember, I had been talking about how I was going to do The Snow Child, and if other people wanted to read it in the month of November as well, we could do kind of like a group read. So in my last Friday Reads video, I mentioned that although I have the book, I had decided that I would do the audio because I had access to the audio on Scribd or Everand. And that's what it was. I had been locked out of it, and on November 17th, I was supposed to have access to the book. So on November 17th, I opened Scribd, and it wasn't available. And now it said it would be available on December 17th. So it got pushed back another month. And if I don't want to turn this into a forum for me to air grievances against companies, but that is frustrating. And it does pertain to something that I said we would read as a group. And so what I did is I cashed in a credit on Libro instead. I tried to get help from Everand. They make it really impossible. They have one of those chatbots on their website, and you have to deal with that first. And it gives very unhelpful responses. And then finally, it allows you to send in a message that will be turned into a ticket. And it really feels like that is run by an AI as well, because it's just sending templates back to you that are not helpful, don't actually relate to the situation at all, because this is sort of a recurring problem I've had with them. And now finally, I mentioned on Instagram that I was looking for alternatives to Everand, and I still am. So if you have them, let me know. My library does not use Hoopla. It does use Libby, so I already have Libby, and I have Libro. I do not use Audible because of the Amazon angle. But so if you have suggestions, let me know. And I got a message from them again saying hey, we're sorry, if you could, and explained why I had lost access to it. Basically, Scribd is here's the thing. It says that if you subscribe, you have unlimited access to things, but you don't actually have unlimited access. And that is something that is wild to me, because up to now, I haven't really minded. But I do think it's weird, because if you advertise yourself as giving unlimited access, you should actually give people unlimited access. What it is their digital rights for audiobooks and ebooks and things. It's based on licensing. So how many copies of a book they are allowed per month, per cycle, and the demand on a book can impact how available it is in Scribd or Everand, and how much you use the app will impact how much access you have to books. So if you read a lot through Everand in 1 month, you might start losing access to books, which is a weird system as well, because if you are sort of like a super user, it seems like that's the type of person that you would really want to support, rather than say, hey, listen, heavy reader, pump the brakes. So because I had listened to 3 books over the last 30 days on Scribd, they pumped the brakes. And that's why when it had said I would get The Snow Child on November 17th, and I didn't. So just throwing that out, total complaint, because I know there are a lot of other people who have had similar problems. So I am still seeking an alternative. Allegedly, an actual customer service representative is going to get back to me at some point. But again, this is not like me trying to publicly shame Everand, but I have heard other people have this problem before. And I feel like at this point I am legitimately seeking another audiobook provider. Again, my library does not use Hoopla. They do use Libby, and I have Libby. I have a subscription to Libro, and I do not use Audible. So if you have other alternatives that are good, let me know in the comment section down below, because that was really annoying this week. And the only other thing to talk about this week before we get into the Friday reads, I can't believe I've been talking for like 20 minutes before we got to the Friday reads part, and we're not even there, is just a PSA from last year that I'm going to bring back up because it seems to resonate with a lot of people last year, and the holidays are upon us in the United States. So it felt like a good time to sort of bring it up because the same thing has already happened to me twice this month. And that is that just be kind to people during the holidays and don't try to invalidate their experiences. The holidays can be tough for a lot of people. A lot of people don't have family that they can spend time with. Thanksgiving in the United States is coming next week, which is, it's got a weird colonial past, but I like the food. I'm in it for the food. So there are weird things attached to the holiday anyway. If people have weird feelings about the holiday, let them have weird feelings about the holiday. If they don't have any family, let them be sad about it, or just let them do their thing. They are allowed to decide how they feel about the holidays. It's not up to you to tell them, oh, the holidays should be a time of joy, because that is not helpful at all. And one thing that is particularly not helpful, and the thing that I mentioned last year, is like some people have complicated relationships with their families. And it's already happened to me twice this month that people have told me I should fix my relationship with my father. So I have not really spoken to my father for about 2.5 years at this point. And I mean, there have been minor conversations in between, some email exchanges. They've only made things worse. Nothing has gotten better. And we don't have to get into my relationship with my father, but I feel freer and better not having him in my life. And every time a conversation has even begun, it immediately goes back to like, oh, nothing has changed. This is just the same old thing. And I'm actually better off not having him in my life, not having a relationship with him. But because he's my father, people assume that I should have a relationship. Like the societal expectation is that you don't turn your back on family. So people will try to tell me, like the thing that's happened to me twice this month already is people tell me, well, you know, he won't be around forever. And my whole thing about that is, as I said, my life feels better without that relationship. And people who say that sometimes don't know the circumstances that led me to that decision. So unless you really intimately know someone and intimately know the dynamics of their family, don't say things about what they should or should not do or what relationship they should or should not have with their family. Leave people alone. They can define who their family is and who has access to them. And society has created this expectation that you are not supposed to turn your back on family. But if your family or a family member has a toxic relationship, you should be able to say, I've had enough. And you should be able to say, that's not good for me. And if we are going to have a relationship, things need to change because I'm not going to keep doing the same thing. And that is the way it is for me, especially from the many conversations that I've had and the email exchanges that I have had with my father over the last 2.5 years. It's clear that he is unwilling to change. So if I am ever to have a relationship with him again, it will not be because things were fixed. It will be because I decided a relationship with my father is more important than my satisfaction. And that's not great. So be kind to people during the holidays. People are allowed to have weird feelings about the holidays. They're allowed to have their own definition of what they want to do, who they talk to. Don't try to tell people, oh, it's the holidays. Just give them a call or something like that. Like, just leave people alone and be kind. You know, people have all different types of circumstances, and that's okay. So With that, let's get into the Friday Reads portion of the video. I finished one book this week, and I am halfway through another, and I am yet to start the next one. The book that I finished was Salamlik by Khaled Al-Ismail, translated by Larry Price. Larry Price, by the way, L-E-R-I, not Larry. It sounds like I'm saying Larry Price. It's Larry Price. Was one of the translators who was nominated for the National Book Award for Translated Fiction. I forget for which book, but Larry Price's name was in there, which I thought was really interesting. So I finished Salamlik, and I really liked this book a great deal. I will say that the book is almost dreamlike, and I'm going to use my hand to cover up the book because there's not actual nudity, but there's a towel, but it's very low. So you start to see some hair that some people might find distasteful. So I'm going to cover it up for you. I don't have a problem with it, but I know it could be a thing for other people. The book is kind of dreamlike. It flits back and forth in time. The protagonist of the book has grown up in Syria, and he's a gay man. He explores bathhouses and gets to know his gay identity, discovered this sort of underground gay scene, and is currently in the book's timeline living in Sweden as a refugee, sort of waiting to determine if he's going to be allowed to stay or if he will be sent back. And if he is sent back, he knows that his life will be in danger because he is a gay man and because of the situation in Syria. And he has to live with that, and he has to be quiet about that. He lives in a building with other refugees who talk about missing home and talk about why they left. And he realizes he cannot have a proper relationship with these people because he cannot be honest with them. If he were to try to relate to them honestly, he would have to out himself. If he were going to tell them why he had to leave Syria, he would have to talk about being gay and the experiences of that. And if he tries to talk to people about his situation trying to get asylum in Sweden, he would have to talk about seeking sanctuary, essentially, as a gay man. And he can't do that. So he is in this building full of people that he feels completely isolated from. And the book moves back and forth in time. He has a fantasy life, and sometimes things will start happening in the book, and then you'll realize that it's a fantasy that he is having. And I do think it leans a little heavily into that in the end. Particularly, like, there's, I think, maybe one imagined orgy too many at the end of the book. And that sort of kept me at a remove. Part of me wanted a little bit more closure from the book. But I think the point of the book is that Farhat, the protagonist, like, he is in this really uncertain limbo state in Sweden, thinking about his life back in Syria and everything that has led him up to this point. And his future is uncertain. And his story is not over. So there's actually a sense of beauty in how there isn't too much closure at the end of the book. But I do think it leans a little too hard into that fantasy dreamlike state toward the end. However, I really liked this book a great deal, and I would highly recommend it to you. I think this book deserves to be an LGBTQ plus classic. I would place it in the arena of books like Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran, which was a book about the gay underground scene in New York City in the 1970s. This definitely deserves to be a classic in that realm, and especially because it deals with the gay underground in Syria closer to the present day. You could also compare it to A Boy's Own Story by Edmund White, but I haven't read that book yet, and I really need to. So I hope that this book gets more traction, is discovered by more people, because it is beautifully written. It's a debut, and I can't wait to see more from Khaled Al-Ismail. And it feels important and urgent and beautiful in a lot of ways. So I really enjoyed this book, and I'm glad that I stuck with it despite all of the stress of the election over the past week. So that was the book that I finished. And as I said, starting on Sunday the 17th, I started having that trouble with Everand and access to the Snow Child. So by Monday, it became clear I was not going to get access to the book on it, because at first I thought it was a mistake. So I cashed in a credit on Libro. So I have been listening to this on audio. I am, I think, 52% of the way into the audio at this point, and I am really enjoying this book. But I feel like Joel the other day asked me, because he's been traveling this week, what I was thinking of the book so far, and I was like, I like it. And he said, well, I feel like you seem very muted on it. And the thing is, until you get further along in the book, it's sort of hard to tell, because it's not that I think it looks longer than it actually is. It's almost 400 pages. So it's not really a long book, but it is a book that I feel like you need to experience the whole story before you really know, because right now I'm enthralled. I'm into this. I'm loving it. But a lot will depend on how it ends, because the setup for this book is that you have Jack and Mabel. And I'm trying to remember, it's 1920 in Alaska. They have recently moved to Alaska. And there are a lot of reasons for that. The primary reason is that they had a stillborn baby. And that loss and the grief over it has propelled them to Alaska to get away from their family, because they can't get away from reminders of the baby that they lost. They can't get away from the recriminations from the family that surround them. And they feel the judgment, especially Mabel. She feels judged that she had been unable to get pregnant for so long, and that when she had a pregnancy, she lost the baby. She feels like very judged by all of those things. And now she's, I believe they are either in their early 40s or mid 40s at this point. So the likelihood that she would ever have another child it's leaving. And it's also interesting because they're, as I said, I am currently 42, so I'm about the same age as Jack and Mabel, but they are described as older people a lot, like old people. And the thing to remember about that is it's 1920. Life expectancy was shorter, but also people lived hard lives. And in their home or homestead in Alaska, Jack is basically farming on his own. So when he talks about being an old man and his body wearing out, it's not because he's in his early or mid 40s. It's because he's doing exceptionally hard labor that wears down his body. So I have to remind myself of all of that stuff. But in Alaska, so feels like he's trying to keep things going. Their relationship is very strained and distant at this point because of everything that they've been through. They've never really talked. This almost is one of those situations where if people just had an honest conversation, there wouldn't be a book. Because if they had open dialogue about their grief and the loss of the child and the fact that they are unlikely to become parents at this point, there really wouldn't be a book. But this is a book where I really don't mind that, because the grief and the inability to connect is kind of the point of what Jack and Mabel are doing. That's why they ended up in Alaska. So one day, Mabel in particular is struggling. She is unable to sort of get through daily life. And on a whim, one day, they start making a snowman. And they realize it's not very big, so they decide to call it a snow child. And they give it a hat, they give it a scarf and mittens, and decorate it with hair, so it becomes a little girl. And in the morning, the snow child that they have created is gone. And they start seeing a little girl, a little blonde girl, in the woods wearing a blue coat, and she is wearing the red mittens and the red scarf from the snow child. And she's always seen with a little fox following her around or in her company. And I have really enjoyed the first half of the book, but so much is going to depend on this, because I was actually nervous, because for a long time, the little girl is almost like a specter around the periphery of their home, and they don't really have contact with her. There isn't really a connection. And I kept thinking, I'm worried that once you actually meet the child, the quality of the book is going to go downhill, because as soon as it's kind of like my classic story about the first season of Lost. You start making mysteries and it's very intriguing, but then as soon as you start providing answers, sometimes it doesn't feel as satisfying. Like the setup is sometimes more satisfying than the conclusion or where the ultimate direction or whatever the resolution is, like the actual experience of this. And what I have found so far is that it is living up to it, but I'm only 52% through. So there's a lot of room for, I still feel like I'm sort of waiting to see how things end up before I really commit to whether or not I like the book. However, I will say the parts that I have read so far are extremely well written. The characterizations are beautiful. I love the characters. I love the way it depicts the scenery and the time. And I love the way it grounds itself in the real world, but dabbles in elements of the fantastic. And I think that is one of the friction points with The Snow Child. It feels like, because The Snow Child is a story, it is a myth, and it actually opens with a quote from The Snow Child. Or sorry, Little Daughter of the Snow, is it? It opens with a quote from it that says, "Wife, let us go into the yard behind and make a little snow girl, and perhaps she will come alive and be a little daughter to us." "Husband," says the old woman, "there's no knowing what may be. Let us go into the yard and make a little snow girl." And that's a quote from Little Daughter of the Snow by Arthur Ransome. So this is a known story. And it's a known story in the book. Like, Mabel remembers reading this story about a snow child who comes real, and writes to her sister, and the sister sends her a copy of the book. So even within the story, you're living in the real world, but it's just interesting that, like, this exists as a fable in this story, which is playing with elements of that fable. And it's going to be interesting. Part of the reason I hold off a little bit is because it's going to be interesting to see how much of it lands down on realism, how much of it lands in the realm of fable and of the fantastic. And I think some people went into this expecting it to be much more in the realm of the fantastic than it is, and those people are disappointed. And people who go into this expecting a realistic depiction of grief and life in Alaska in 1920 have this element of the fantastic that just kind of feels annoying to them. So I feel like if you lean in either direction, you're probably going to be unsatisfied. But if you aim for like a middle, you're going to be just fine. So I've been really liking this book so far. And if you have read it and have non-spoilery comments about the first half, let us know. Put them in the comment section down below. Maybe just tag it like The Snow Child, so people who maybe haven't read it yet might avoid the discussion so far. And we can go about that way. I should be done with this by the time I do a next Friday Reads, because when I'm listening to it, it goes very quickly. So I finished Salamlik on Monday, maybe Tuesday. And I have been supposed to read The Most by Jessica Anthony all week. This is a short book. I should be able to power through it once I have time. I have not picked it up. It's just been a very stressful week, and for a lot of reasons, we don't have to get into it. A lot of stuff going on. And, you know, some of it is election related. You can probably guess based on that. But so I just haven't really had the mental and emotional bandwidth. And usually what's happening, and you can tell I like The Snow Child, because usually what's been happening over the last 2 days is if I have time to devote to reading, I have been listening to The Snow Child rather than start The Most by Jessica Anthony, which I need to do because it is actually due back at the library yesterday. So I'm unable to renew it because there are holds on it. So if you live in Montana and are waiting for The Most by Jessica Anthony, I apologize. I am the problem. But I'm hoping that this weekend I will be able to sit down with it and read it. It's very short. It is 133 pages. So I should be done with it by this weekend, and maybe I'll just pop it back to the library. But I apologize if you are one of the people I am making wait for the book. So that's it. That's my Friday Reads video for this week. I did the Washington Post's 10 best books of 2024. I was hoping to do a video about their 50 notable works that they released. They don't usually do that, and it feels like a direct play off of the New York Times 100 notable. I was locked out of it this morning. I'm hoping that when it's too late for me to try to film the video today, so I'll probably try to film it on Monday if I can have access to the article, and then have it for you on Tuesday. And then my plan is to film my book haul for November early next week, so you'll have a video from me on Thanksgiving as well. And I don't know what I'm going to do for a Friday Reads. Maybe I'm guessing that the New York Times is going to release its 100 notable. So if they do early enough, I might slot that in as a Friday Reads in place of a Friday Reads. Or I'm just going to film my Friday Reads on Wednesday, and we'll see how things go. So I'll just have filmed it earlier than usual. That's what to expect over the next week. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.